I worked as a prison guard for 30 days. On day 1, I thought being a prison guard was mostly about watching cell doors, keeping dangerous people under control, and making sure nobody escaped. By day 30, I realized I had completely misunderstood the job. Because during those 30 days, I learned how quickly a quiet hallway could turn into a crisis. I learned that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't always the loudest one. I learned that a prison guard spends far more time watching, listening, and communicating than I ever expected. And I learned that sometimes the hardest part of the job isn't dealing with the people inside. It's dealing with what the job does to you. This is what happened when I worked as a prison guard for 30 days. # day 1. My first day started at 5:30 in the morning. I was standing outside a correctional facility staring at a massive concrete building, wondering if I had made the worst decision of my life. The building looked exactly like you'd imagine. Concrete walls, security fences, cameras, steel gates. Nothing about it looked welcoming. I walked through the first security checkpoint wearing a brand new uniform that still felt uncomfortable. Then came the second checkpoint, then the third. By the time I finally entered the main facility, I had already been searched, checked, and given a list of rules that seemed to have no end. My training officer was a veteran correctional officer named Harris. He had been working there for almost 20 years. The first thing he told me was simple: don't try to be tough. I thought that was strange. I expected him to tell me to be confident. Instead, he explained that the worst thing a new officer could do was walk into a prison trying to prove something. You don't need to scare anyone, he told me. You need to be predictable. That became my first lesson. Stay calm, follow procedure, don't make promises, and never assume you know what's happening. My first few hours were mostly observation. I watched officers conduct security checks. I watched them communicate with inmates. I watched them monitor the housing units. And I quickly realized that the job was much more about observation than confrontation. Officers weren't just looking for obvious problems. They were looking for changes. Someone who suddenly stopped talking. Someone who wasn't eating. Someone acting differently from normal. A change in routine could mean nothing. Or it could be the first warning that something was about to happen. By the end of day 1, I was exhausted. And I hadn't even been involved in a serious incident. I went home thinking, 30 days is a long time. I had no idea how right I was. # day 3. By day 3, I had started learning the basic rhythm of the facility. Morning counts, security checks, movement between areas, meal distribution, paperwork, radio calls, then repeating everything again. It wasn't glamorous. Most of the job was routine, but I was beginning to understand why routine mattered. In a prison, predictable procedures create control. Everyone knows what is supposed to happen, so when something doesn't happen, you notice. That was when I started realizing that the job wasn't about reacting to chaos. It was about preventing chaos. And sometimes that meant having difficult conversations. One morning, an inmate refused to return to his cell. He wasn't attacking anyone. He wasn't threatening anyone. He simply refused to move. My first instinct was to think the situation was going to become violent. Harris didn't seem worried. He approached the man calmly. He gave him a clear instruction. The man argued. Harris waited. Then he repeated the instruction. No yelling, no insults, no unnecessary threats, just calm, consistent communication. Eventually, the inmate turned around and walked back to his cell. The whole thing lasted less than 5 minutes. I remember thinking, that's it? Harris looked at me. Exactly. I realized that a good prison guard doesn't win by overpowering everyone. They win by keeping situations from becoming fights in the first place. # day 5. Day 5 was the first time I made a mistake. It wasn't a huge mistake, but it was enough to make me understand how seriously small details were taken. During a routine check, I missed something I was supposed to notice. A door that wasn't secured exactly the way it should have been. Harris caught it immediately. I felt embarrassed. He didn't yell. He simply told me to check it again, then again, then again. You're going to get tired, he said. That's when you make mistakes. That stuck with me. Because prison work isn't always physically exhausting. Sometimes it's mentally exhausting. You're expected to pay attention for hours, even when nothing is happening. especially when nothing is happening, because the moment you stop paying attention, something might happen. Day 7. By the end of my first week, I had started recognizing faces. Not just inmates, officers too. I was beginning to understand the personalities of the people I worked with. Some officers were extremely serious. Others joked constantly. Some were quiet. Some talked to everyone. But the best officers all had something in common. They knew when to be serious. They knew when to listen. And they didn't treat every situation like an emergency. That week, I also learned something unexpected. You don't have to hate the people you're responsible for supervising. In fact, doing that might make your job harder. You can hold someone accountable without treating them like they're less than human. That didn't mean trusting everyone. It meant understanding people. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized that understanding people was one of the most important skills in the entire job. Day 10. Day 10 was the first time I heard an alarm. I was walking through a corridor when suddenly the radio traffic changed. Officers started moving. Doors began locking. Everyone became more focused. I didn't know what was happening. That was one of the strangest parts of the job. Sometimes you could hear something happening before you knew what it was. You might hear a radio call, see officers moving quickly, hear doors closing, and have absolutely no idea what was happening behind the next door. I wanted to follow. Instead, I was told to hold my position, so I waited. A few minutes later, I learned there had been a fight. It had been contained quickly. But I realized something important that day. In an emergency, the instinct to run toward the problem isn't always useful. Sometimes the best thing you can do is follow instructions and stay exactly where you're supposed to be. Day 14. 2 weeks in, I was finally starting to feel comfortable. That turned out to be dangerous, because the moment you think you've figured out the job, something reminds you that you haven't. One afternoon, I was talking with another officer when we noticed an inmate behaving strangely. Nothing obvious, no shouting, no violence, just something different. The officer knew him better than I did. He noticed immediately. We checked on the situation. It turned out there was a personal problem happening that had nothing to do with the prison itself. The inmate was dealing with something serious outside, and that was affecting his behavior inside. That day changed the way I looked at the job. People don't leave their problems at the prison entrance. They bring them with them. Family problems, fear, anger, regret, mental health struggles. Sometimes all of those things at once, and the officers have to deal with the consequences. Day 17. By day 17, I had stopped feeling like a tourist. I knew the procedures. I knew the routines. I knew where I was supposed to be. And I was starting to recognize when something didn't feel right. Then I made another mistake. This one was worse. I misunderstood a radio communication and moved when I wasn't supposed to. Nothing terrible happened, but it could have. My supervisor pulled me aside. He wasn't angry. That almost made it worse. He explained that inside a prison, communication isn't a minor detail. It can determine whether people stay safe. That night, I went home thinking about how much responsibility correctional officers actually carry. One misunderstood message, one missed warning, one bad decision, and the consequences can be serious. Day 21. Something changed around the third week. I noticed I was no longer constantly thinking about myself. On day 1, I was thinking, am I doing this right? Am I safe? Do I look nervous? By day 21, I was thinking about the environment. Who was where? What was happening? What seemed normal? What didn't? I had started becoming part of the routine. And that's when the job started feeling real. But I also started noticing something else. The job followed me home. I wasn't having nightmares. I wasn't terrified. But I found myself thinking about things differently. When I heard a loud noise in public, I noticed it. When I entered a crowded building, I automatically looked for exits. When I saw people arguing, I paid attention to their body language. 30 days wasn't long enough to completely change me, but it was long enough to change the way I looked at the world. Day 24. Day 24 was the closest I came to being involved in a serious incident. It started with shouting, then a sudden movement, then officers reacting. Everything happened incredibly quickly. One second, the situation looked under control. The next, everyone was moving. I remember my heart racing. I remember thinking about everything I had learned over the previous 3 weeks. Stay calm. Follow instructions. Don't rush blindly. Watch what is happening. And communicate. The situation was eventually contained. No one was killed. No one suffered life-changing injuries. But standing there afterward, I realized something. You can learn procedures. You can practice scenarios. You can listen to experienced officers. But nothing completely prepares you for the moment when something actually happens. The difference is that preparation gives you something to fall back on. And I was starting to understand why training mattered so much. #DA27. By day 27, I had become comfortable enough to have normal conversations with some of the inmates. That might sound strange, but I began to realize that most interactions weren't dramatic. People asked questions, complained about food, talked about sports, argued about television, had bad days, had good days. The environment was unusual, but human behavior was still human behavior. Of course, there were people I didn't trust. There were people I kept my distance from. And there were situations where I remained extremely cautious. But I stopped seeing everyone as a stereotype. That was probably the biggest change in me. I had entered the prison thinking I was going to learn about criminals. Instead, I learned a lot about people. #Day 29. Then came day 29. The day I almost decided I didn't want this job. It was late in the shift. Everything had been normal, almost too normal. Then a situation developed in one of the housing units. The details aren't something I can describe as a dramatic movie scene. There were no explosions, no giant prison riot, just a tense situation that could have become much worse. Officers responded. Communication started. The unit was secured. And eventually, everything calmed down. But afterward, I found myself thinking, could I really do this every day? Because that's the part people don't see. The job isn't just about the moments that happen. It's about knowing those moments could happen again tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. #DI30. My final day felt strange. I had spent a month walking through the same gates, the same corridors, the same security checkpoints. But now everything felt different. I knew the sounds, the routines, the procedures. I knew what it felt like when something was about to change. I knew that silence didn't always mean peace. And I knew that the loudest person in the room wasn't necessarily the most dangerous. On my final shift, Harris asked me the question I'd been expecting for 30 days. So? I looked at him. So what? Would you do it? I thought about it. 30 days earlier, I would have said yes or no immediately. Now I wasn't sure. Because I had learned that being a prison guard isn't one job. It's 100 different jobs at once. You're security. You're a communicator. You're an observer. Sometimes you're a mediator. Sometimes you're the person responsible for keeping everyone calm when nobody else is. And sometimes you're simply standing in a hallway, waiting for the next radio call. The job is stressful. It's repetitive. It's unpredictable. And it isn't for everyone. But I also left with a completely different respect for the people who do it every day. Because the hardest part isn't being tough. It's staying calm. It's paying attention. It's treating people fairly. And it's understanding that every day could be completely normal. Until suddenly, it isn't. When I walked out of the facility for the last time, the gates closed behind me. And I realized something. I had entered that prison thinking I was going to spend 30 days watching other people. But the entire time, I had actually been watching myself. How I reacted to pressure, how I handled fear, how quickly I judged people, and how much I could adapt when I was forced to. Would I work as a prison guard again? Maybe. But I definitely wouldn't walk into that building on day one with the same attitude. Because after 30 days, I learned that the job isn't really about controlling people. It's about controlling yourself. And tomorrow, I'm trading steel doors and concrete walls for something much, much higher. Tomorrow, I'm going to work as an astronaut.